The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across Kingfisher's Main Street as 19-year-old Lillian Evans buried the last remnants of her old life along with her father's body. She stood alone at the edge of the small Oklahoma Territory cemetery, her trembling hands clutching the worn Bible that had been her mother's only legacy before consumption had claimed her 3 winters past. It was 1889, and the newly opened territory was a dangerous place for a young woman with no family and no prospects. The small plot of land her father had staked during the land run earlier that year would soon be seized for unpaid debts Lillian knew nothing about, until Sheriff Tate had appeared on their doorstep this morning, minutes after her father had drawn his final breath. "You've got 2 days to clear out, Miss Evans," the sheriff had said, not unkindly but with finality that brooked no argument. "I'm sorry about your pa, but the bank's got legal claim now." As twilight deepened, Lillian made her way back to the small cabin that had briefly been home. Inside, she moved with purpose, packing what little she could carry. Her eyes fell on her father's old trunk, and she lifted the heavy lid to find his clothes too big for her slender frame but serviceable. Beneath them lay a pair of shears, sharp enough to cut the long chestnut hair that hung to her waist. Her decision was made in that moment of desperation. In a world where a lone woman was prey, she would become invisible. She would become someone else entirely. By dawn, Lillian Evans had vanished. In her place stood a slender youth with close-cropped hair, her father's clothes hanging loose on her frame, and a determination born of necessity burning in her eyes. She bound her chest tightly with strips of cloth, practiced lowering her voice, and studied her reflection in the small, cracked mirror. "Lee," she whispered to herself, testing the name. "Lee Evans." 2 days later, Lee rode west on her father's old mare with everything she owned tied in a bundle behind the saddle, including the dress and corset she'd left behind along with her identity. The Oklahoma Territory spread before her like an open book with blank pages waiting to be filled. 3 months of hard travel found Lee in the small settlement of Copper Creek, Arizona Territory. She'd learned quickly that being a young man alone on the trail was nearly as dangerous as being a woman, but she'd also discovered an unexpected talent for cards that kept her in food and shelter. She played just well enough to win a modest amount, but not so well as to draw unwanted attention. Her slight build and beardless face drew occasional comments, but she'd perfected a story about being 19, but slow to grow, that most accepted without question. She kept to herself, spoke little, and watched everything. At night, alone in whatever lodging she could afford, she unwound the bindings that constricted her breathing and allowed herself to remember, briefly, what it felt like to be Lillian. The Copper Creek saloon was crowded the night her life changed again. Lee had been in town for nearly a week, taking odd jobs at the livery stable and playing cards in the evenings. She'd managed to accumulate a small but respectable sum, and was considering moving on before anyone looked too closely at the young man who never visited the brothel and bathed in private. She was nursing a whiskey she hadn't actually drunk when the doors swung open, bringing a gust of autumn wind and a tall figure silhouetted against the fading daylight. The saloon fell quiet for a moment before the piano player resumed his tinny melody and conversations slowly rekindled. The newcomer stepped fully into the light, and Lee felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, not of the man himself, but of something in his bearing that reminded her of her father in his better days. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a face weathered by sun and wind, he carried himself with quiet confidence. When his eyes swept the room and briefly met hers, Lee quickly looked down at her cards. Something about his gaze had seemed too perceptive, too knowing. "Deal me in next hand," a deep voice said from behind her shoulder minutes later. Lee nodded without looking up, and when the current hand finished, she silently dealt the newcomer into the game. Up close, she could see his strong, tanned hands and the fine lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though his expression now was serious as he studied his cards. "Samuel Orton," he offered without prompting. "Passing through on my way to my brother's ranch about 30 miles west." "Lee," she replied, keeping her voice deliberately gruff. "Just Lee." For 3 hours they played cards with 2 other men, a storekeeper named Wilson and a grizzled prospector who called himself Lucky Pete despite all evidence to the contrary. Samuel Orton played shrewdly but not aggressively, and by the time the others drifted away, he and Lee were roughly even in winnings. "You play a careful game, Lee," he remarked as they sat alone at the table, each with a final drink. "Not like most young men I know." She shrugged, uncomfortable under his steady gaze. "Don't have much to lose. Makes a man cautious." Samuel nodded, but something in his expression told Lee he wasn't entirely convinced. "Where you headed?" he asked. "Nowhere particular," she answered. "Just looking for work that pays." He studied her for a long moment, and Lee fought the urge to fidget under his scrutiny. "My brother's looking for hands," he said finally. "Nothing fancy, just honest work with cattle. 3 squares and a bunk in the bunkhouse. Pays fair." Lee hesitated. Working at her ranch meant close quarters with other men, but it also meant security and a chance to build up her savings. "Might be interested," she said cautiously. "Riding out tomorrow at dawn if you want to tag along," Samuel said, rising to his feet. "No obligation to stay if you don't like it." After he'd gone, Lee sat alone, weighing her options. Something about Samuel Orton unsettled her, not in a threatening way, but as if he could see more than she wanted anyone to see. Yet the prospect of steady work was too tempting to dismiss. Dawn found her waiting by the livery, her few possessions packed and her mare saddled. Samuel arrived precisely when he said he would, nodding in approval at her punctuality. "Not much for conversation in the morning, so don't feel you need to fill the silence," he said as they rode out of town. Lee was grateful for this, as it allowed her to observe him without the pressure of maintaining conversation. Samuel rode with the easy grace of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. Occasionally, he would point out landmarks or comment on the weather, but mostly they traveled in companionable silence. They made camp as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Samuel efficiently built a small fire while Lee tended to their horses, grateful for tasks that required little talk. "You've got a good hand with that mare," Samuel observed as she finished brushing down her mount. "She trusts you." "She was my pa's," Lee said, the truth slipping out before she could consider it. "Had her since she was a foal." Samuel nodded. "A good horse is better than gold out here." He handed her a tin plate with beans and bacon. "Eat up. We'll reach the Circle by midday tomorrow." That night, lying on her bedroll under the vast Arizona sky, Lee listened to Samuel's steady breathing from the other side of the dying fire. In the 3 months since she'd left Oklahoma, this was the closest she'd allowed anyone to come. The knowledge made her uneasy, but there was something about Samuel Orton that inspired an unfamiliar sense of safety. The Circle O Ranch sprawled across a verdant valley nestled between rugged hills, a surprising oasis in the often harsh terrain. As they crested the final rise, Lee caught her breath at the sight of green pastures dotted with cattle, a large main house of timber and stone, and several outbuildings including a bunkhouse, barn, and corral. "My brother Seth built this place from nothing 15 years ago," Samuel said, pride evident in his voice. "Started with 50 head and a dream. Now he's running close to 1,000. A tall man who strongly resembled Samuel emerged from the main house as they rode into the yard. The brothers embraced warmly, slapping each other's backs with obvious affection. "Who's this you've brought me?" Seth asked, turning to Lee with the same piercing gaze his brother possessed. "Lee Evans," Samuel answered before she could speak. "Handy with horses and looking for work. Thought you might have use for him." Seth assessed Lee with a quick glance that seemed to take in everything from her two large clothes to her small, calloused hands. "Can you ride, boy?" "Yes, sir," she answered, keeping her voice low and steady. "We'll see," Seth said, not unkindly. "Bunkhouse is over there. Find Miguel, he'll show you where to stow your gear." As Lee led her mare toward the barn, she could feel Samuel's eyes following her. The sensation prickled along her spine, but she resisted the urge to look back. The next week settled into a rhythm of hard work and careful vigilance. Lee rose before dawn, binding herself tightly before any of the other hands were awake. She worked with single-minded focus, volunteering for tasks that kept her away from the main group, riding fence lines, checking on distant herds, hunting for strays. The other ranch hands, mostly Mexicans with a few Americans mixed in, initially regarded her with curiosity, but eventually accepted the quiet boy who worked hard and kept to himself. Samuel divided his time between the ranch and trips to nearby settlements, handling business matters for his brother. Whenever he was present, Lee felt that same unsettling awareness, as if his eyes could penetrate her careful disguise. She did her best to avoid direct interaction, but on a ranch of even the Circle O's size, such avoidance was impossible. One evening, nearly a month after her arrival, Lee was alone in the barn treating a cut on her mare's leg when Samuel appeared in the doorway. "You've been avoiding me, Lee Evans," he said without preamble. "No, sir," she answered, focusing on the task at hand. "Just doing my job." "A job you do well," he acknowledged, stepping closer. "Better than most men twice your size." The compliment warmed her unexpectedly. "Thank you, sir." "Sam," he corrected. "We don't stand on ceremony here." She nodded, still not meeting his eyes. "You're not from around these parts," he observed, leaning against a post. "That accent Oklahoma, maybe." Lee tensed. "Traveled some," she said vaguely, running from something. His tone was casual, but the question was not. She finally looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "Aren't we all?" Something flickered in his eyes, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "I suppose we are, in our way." They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken questions. "Seth's impressed with your work," Samuel said finally. "Wants to send you with me to escort a herd to the railhead next week. 4 days ride north." Lee's heart sank. 4 days alone on the trail with Samuel Orton was exactly what she'd been avoiding. "Surely there are others more qualified," she said. "He thinks you've earned the chance," Samuel replied, "and I requested you specifically." Her eyes snapped to his face. "Why?" His smile was enigmatic. "Because you're careful, Lee Evans. Careful with the stock, careful with that mare of yours, careful with your words. I value careful when I'm moving prime beef through open country." There seemed no way to refuse without raising suspicion. "When do we leave?" "Dawn, Monday next." 20 head of prime steers for the Chicago market. After he left, Lee sat heavily on a hay bale, her mind racing. 4 days on the trail meant no privacy, no opportunity to remove the increasingly painful bindings, no respite from the constant vigilance that had become second nature. The drive began as planned, with Lee and Samuel pushing 20 fat steers north toward the railhead at Flagstaff. The animals were docile enough, well trained to follow the lead steer, which made the work manageable for just 2 drovers. They settled into a pattern riding, resting the herd at midday, making camp at dusk. On the second night, as they sat by their small fire after a meal of beans and jerky, Samuel studied Lee across the flames. "You know," he said conversationally, "my mother used to bind her chest when she rode." Lee froze, her tin cup halfway to her lips. "Said it was painful but necessary for a woman who spent all day in the saddle," Samuel continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "She taught my sister the same trick." Lee's mind raced for a response but found none. Denial seemed pointless. The knowing look in Samuel's eyes told her he wasn't guessing. "How long have you known?" she finally asked, her natural voice emerging for the first time in months. "Suspected from the first day in Copper Creek," he answered. "Known for certain since your second week at the ranch. The way you move, the care you take with privacy, certain absences during monthly times." Heat flooded her face. "Does everyone know?" "No," he said firmly. "Most men see what they expect to see, and you play your part well." "Why haven't you said anything? Why offer me work knowing I was lying?" Samuel poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. "I figured you had your reasons, good ones, judging by the lengths you've gone to." The relief of being seen, truly seen after months of hiding, was overwhelming. Tears pricked at Lee's eyes and she blinked them back furiously. "What's your real name?" Samuel asked gently. "Lillian," she whispered. "Lillian Evans." "That much was true," he nodded. "Suits you better than Lee." "Are you going to tell your brother?" "The others?" Samuel shook his head. "That's your story to tell if and when you choose to. But I will say this: Seth is a good man. He wouldn't turn away a hard worker because she happens to be a woman." Lillian sat in silence, absorbing this unexpected turn of events. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what? For not exposing me, for trusting there was a reason." "There is a reason, isn't there?" His voice was soft, inviting confidence without demanding it. The story spilled out of her, then her father's death, the debts, the danger facing a young woman alone. Samuel listened without interruption, his face grave. "You've shown remarkable courage," he said when she finished. "Most would have sought the protection of marriage or family." "I had neither to seek," she answered simply. They sat in silence for a long while, the crackling fire and lowing of the cattle the only sounds in the vast darkness. "You should get some sleep," Samuel said eventually. "I'll take first watch." Lillian nodded, suddenly exhausted by the weight of truth after so long carrying deception. As she rolled herself in her blanket, she felt lighter somehow, as if sharing her secret had lifted a burden she hadn't fully acknowledged. "Lillian," Samuel said softly as she drifted toward sleep. "Your secret is safe with me, but know this: you don't have to face the world alone anymore." The words followed her into dreams more peaceful than any she'd known since leaving Oklahoma. The remaining 2 days of the cattle drive passed in a strange new harmony. By day, Lillian maintained her disguise as Lee, but in the privacy of their evening camps, she spoke in her natural voice and answered Samuel's careful questions about her life before. For his part, Samuel shared stories of his own growing up on a small farm in Missouri, losing both parents to influenza when he was 20, wandering west with his brother to make their fortunes in the newly opened territories. "Seth was always the one with ambition," he explained. "I was content to drift, taking work where I found it, moving on when the itch took me." "And now?" Lillian asked. Samuel's eyes held hers across the fire. "Now I'm finding reasons to put down roots." The meaning behind his words hung in the air between them, unacknowledged but undeniable. Lillian looked away first, uncertain how to respond to the warmth his gaze kindled within her. After delivering the cattle and collecting payment in Flagstaff, they began the journey back to the Circle O. Riding side by side through the pine-scented forests of northern Arizona, Lillian found herself relaxing in Samuel's company in a way she hadn't with anyone since before her father's death. "What will you do now?" he asked as they made camp on their first night of the return journey. "Continue as Lee, or—" Lillian prodded the fire with a stick, watching the embers glow and fade. "I don't know," she admitted. "Being Lee has kept me safe, given me independence I never had before." "But at what cost?" Samuel's voice was gentle. "Living in fear of discovery, binding yourself until you can hardly breathe, cutting yourself off from any real connection. What choice do I have? The world isn't kind to women alone. It doesn't have to be alone, Lillian." She looked up sharply at that, finding his eyes intent upon her face. "What are you saying, Samuel?" "I'm saying there are options between hiding who you are and facing the world unprotected." He hesitated. "I'm saying I care what happens to you." The admission hung between them, fragile and significant. Lillian felt something shift within her chest that had nothing to do with her bindings. "I've known you barely a month," she said softly, "and yet I feel I know the real you better than most," he countered. "The courage it takes to do what you've done, the strength to survive on your own terms, those things tell me more about you than years of casual acquaintance could." Lillian stared into the fire, her thoughts in turmoil. For months, survival had been her only goal, one day following another in a desperate bid to remain safe and independent. She hadn't allowed herself to consider a future beyond the next town, the next job, the next meal. "I'm not asking for promises," Samuel said, seeming to read her thoughts. "Just asking you to consider possibilities." When they returned to the Circle O, Lillian resumed her role as Lee with a new awareness of Samuel's constant, protective presence. He made no obvious changes in his behavior toward her in front of others, but she felt his eyes following her, noticed how he contrived to assign them tasks together, creating small pockets of privacy where she could speak freely. A week after their return, Seth announced plans for a journey to Tucson to negotiate cattle contracts, and named Samuel as temporary foreman in his absence. "It's an opportunity," Samuel told Lillian that evening as they checked a remote water trough together. "With Seth gone, we could introduce Lillian to the ranch as my friend from back east, perhaps. Say she's looking for a position as housekeeper or cook." The suggestion took her breath away. "You want me to simply appear? What about Lee?" "Lee could have a family emergency, return east to handle matters," Samuel suggested, "and in his place his cousin Lillian arrives seeking work." "That's madness," she protested. "Everyone would know immediately." "Would they? You've kept your distance from most of the hands. Changed your hair, your voice, your mannerisms. Dressed in clothes that disguise your true form." He smiled. "Besides, as I said, men see what they expect to see." The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. To reclaim her identity, to dress as a woman again, to speak in her natural voice, these simple freedoms had seemed lost to her forever. "I don't even have proper clothes," she said weakly. Samuel's smile broadened. "Already thought of that. There's a trunk of my late sister-in-law's things in the attic. Seth keeps meaning to donate them but never gets around to it. She was about your size, I'd wager. Seth's wife. I didn't know he was married. Catherine died in childbirth 5 years ago. The baby too." Samuel's expression sobered. "It nearly destroyed him. He's never spoken of remarrying." Lillian's heart ached for the loss that hung like a shadow over the thriving ranch. "And you think he wouldn't mind me using her things?" "Better they clothe a living woman than gather dust," Samuel said simply. "I'll retrieve a few items tonight." 2 days later, Seth departed for Tucson, leaving Samuel in charge of the ranch operations. That same evening, Lee packed his few belongings and left a note explaining a family emergency back in Oklahoma required his immediate attention. The next morning, a wagon arrived from town carrying Miss Lillian Evans, a distant cousin of the Ortons seeking employment after the death of her father. Samuel introduced her to the ranch hands with a carefully constructed story of childhood friendship renewed through correspondence. Wearing one of Catherine Orton's simple calico dresses, her hair pinned up as best she could manage with its short length, Lillian felt both exposed and liberated. The ranch hands regarded her with curiosity, but no recognition, confirming Samuel's theory about people seeing only what they expected to see. Miguel, the ranch foreman, showed her to a small bedroom off the kitchen that had once belonged to the previous cook. The space was modest but private, a luxury Lillian hadn't known since leaving home. "It is good to have a woman's touch in the house again," Miguel told her, his weathered face creasing in a kind smile. "Since Senora Catherine passed, this place has missed the softness only a woman brings." Lillian settled into a new routine, cooking meals for the hands, keeping the main house in order, and gradually allowing herself to relax into her reclaimed identity. Samuel visited the house frequently, ostensibly to discuss ranch business, but increasingly to simply enjoy her company. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. Their conversations ranged widely: books they had read, places they had seen, dreams they had harbored before life intervened. "I always wanted to see the ocean," Lillian confessed one night. "My father promised to take me to California someday." "I've seen it," Samuel said. "Worked a ranch near San Diego for a season. Nothing prepares you for the vastness of it like the sky turned liquid and stretched to the horizon." "Will you tell me about it?" she asked, and listened, entranced as he described the endless blue waters, the rhythm of the waves, the cry of seabirds wheeling overhead. As the days passed, Lillian found herself watching for Samuel's approach, her heart quickening at the sound of his voice. He never presumed upon their growing closeness, maintaining a careful respect that only increased her regard for him. 2 weeks after Seth's departure, Samuel received word that his brother's business in Tucson was taking longer than expected, and he would remain there for at least another month. "He's arranged to purchase a significant herd," Samuel explained as they walked together through the kitchen garden Lillian had begun reviving. "It's a good opportunity for the ranch, but requires complicated negotiations." "You must miss him," Lillian observed, noting the concern in Samuel's eyes. "We've rarely been separated for long," he acknowledged. "But I confess, his absence has allowed certain developments I value greatly." His gaze held hers, and Lillian felt heat rise in her cheeks. "As do I," she admitted softly. Samuel reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Lillian, I need to tell you something," her heart stuttered. "Yes. I've been offered a position foreman on a ranch near Santa Fe, good pay, responsibilities of my own." He paused. "I've been considering it for some time, but now," she prompted when he fell silent, "now I find myself reluctant to leave, unless—" He hesitated, then seemed to gather his courage. "Unless you might consider coming with me," Lillian's breath caught. "As what, Samuel?" "As my wife," he said simply. "If you do me the honor." The world seemed to still around them, the gentle breeze, the distant lowing of cattle, the call of a hawk overhead, all receding as his words echoed in her mind. "We've known each other such a short time," she whispered. "And yet I feel I've seen the real you." Both Lee's courage and Lillian's gentle heart. "I've never been more certain of anything." She searched his face and found only sincerity in his clear gaze. "I need time to think," she said finally. Samuel nodded, raising her hand to his lips in a gesture that sent warmth cascading through her. "Take all the time you need. My heart isn't going anywhere." That night, Alone in her small room, Lillian confronted the fear that had been her constant companion for months. The safety she'd found in her disguise had become its own kind of prison, keeping her isolated from true connection. Samuel offered something she'd stopped allowing herself to want: a future built on honesty and mutual respect. As dawn broke over the distant mountains, Lillian made her decision. She found Samuel in the barn, checking a mare about to foal. He looked up as she entered, his face carefully neutral though hope flickered in his eyes. "I have an answer for you," she said without preamble. Samuel straightened, giving her his full attention. "I'm listening." "Before I give it, I need to know something." She took a deep breath. "If I accept, would I be Lillian to you always? Never expected to become Lee again to hide who I am?" "I fell in love with both parts of you," he said, the declaration making her heart leap. "But I would never ask you to be anyone but yourself, the woman brave enough to forge her own path in a world that tried to deny her choices." Tears welled in her eyes. "Then my answer is yes, Samuel Orton. I will marry you." The joy that transformed his face was answer enough, but when he crossed the space between them and gathered her gently into his arms, Lillian knew she had found her true home. Their kiss was tentative at first, then deepening with a certainty that burned away the last of her doubts. When they finally parted, both breathing quickly, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "We'll build something good together," he promised. "A life where neither of us has to hide who we truly are." The weeks that followed were filled with quiet joy as they planned their future. Samuel wrote to accept the position in Santa Fe, with the condition that he could not start until after his brother's return and his own wedding. Their evenings were spent in conversation about the home they would create, the life they would build together. Samuel spoke of a small ranch of their own someday, where they could raise cattle and children with equal care. "Would you want that?" he asked one night as they sat on the porch swing, her hand clasped in his. "Children? I think so," Lillian answered honestly. "I've never really allowed myself to imagine it before. Everything was always about survival, about the next day. And now," she smiled, leaning against his shoulder, "now I find myself thinking of next years, not just next days." Seth's return in late October brought both joy and anxiety. Samuel had written to his brother about his engagement to the new housekeeper, but had not revealed Lillian's former identity as Lee. He should know the truth, Lillian insisted the night before Seth's expected arrival. "I don't want to build our future on deception, even if it was necessary at the time." Samuel nodded, his expression serious. "You're right. We'll tell him together." Seth Orton proved as perceptive as his brother. After the initial greetings and business discussions, Samuel and Lillian sat with him in the study and shared the full story. "Lee and Lillian are one and the same," Samuel concluded, his arm protective around Lillian's shoulders. "I discovered the truth during our cattle drive, and since then." Seth looked between them, his expression unreadable. "You're telling me our best ranch hand this past season was a woman in disguise?" Lillian nodded, tension knotting her stomach. "I had no other options at the time, Mr. Orton. I hope you can understand the necessity that drove me to deception." To their surprise, Seth laughed, a rich, genuine sound that filled the room. "Understand? I'm amazed. You outworked men twice your size, never complained, and handled some of our most skittish stock with ease." He shook his head in admiration. "If that doesn't prove what I've always suspected about women's capabilities, nothing would." Relief washed over Lillian. "Then you're not angry about the deception." "How could I be?" Seth's eyes were kind as they met hers. "Life forces hard choices on all of us. You did what was necessary to survive, and in doing so, proved your worth a dozen times over." He turned to Samuel. "And you, Brother finally found a woman who matches your own restless spirit. Samuel's arm tightened around Lillian. Found the one who makes that spirit want to settle, he corrected. Seth's expression softened. Catherine would have liked you, he told Lillian. She had that same determination, that same fire. Coming from him, there could be no higher compliment. The wedding took place on a clear November day, with the circle O's hands and a few neighbors as witnesses. Lillian wore a simple ivory dress that had been Catherine's, carefully altered to fit her slender frame. Seth had insisted on giving it to her, along with a mother-of-pearl comb to secure the veil in her still short hair. "Something of the past to bless your future," he said gruffly when she tried to thank him. Samuel waited for her on the porch of the main house, his usually weathered face alight with joy as she approached on Seth's arm. The local minister spoke the traditional words, but it was the private vows they had written that brought tears to Lillian's eyes. "I promise to truly see you every day of our life together," Samuel said, his voice steady and sure. "To value your strength as much as your gentleness, your courage as much as your heart." "I promise to live honestly with you," Lillian responded. "To be fully myself, neither hiding behind masks nor forgetting the lessons they taught me. To build a life where we both can be exactly who we are meant to be." Their kiss sealed these promises, and the cheer that went up from the assembled guests carried across the valley like a blessing. The journey to Santa Fe took nearly 2 weeks, with stops in small towns along the way. In each new place, Lillian experienced the simple pleasure of introducing herself by her true name, standing proudly beside her husband without fear or pretense. The ranch where Samuel would serve as foreman sprawled across a high plateau with views of distant mountains. The owner, a widow named Mrs. Thornton, had built the operation from nothing after her husband's death 10 years earlier. She welcomed them with genuine warmth, showing them to the comfortable 2-room cabin that would be their home. "It's not fancy," she apologized, "but it's solid and dry. Added a new stove last year that heats the whole place nicely." "It's perfect," Lillian assured her, already envisioning curtains for the windows and a garden plot come spring. That night, as they lay together in their own bed for the first time, Samuel traced the curve of Lillian's cheek with gentle fingers. "Happy?" he asked softly. "More than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. "A year ago, I was burying my father and facing a future that terrified me. Now, she smiled in the darkness. "Now I'm exactly where I'm meant to be with exactly who I'm meant to be with." Samuel gathered her closer. "You know, when I first saw you in that saloon in Copper Creek, something told me you were different, special, even before I suspected your secret." "And when did you first know for certain?" "That I was a woman," he chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her ear where it rested on his chest. "The second night at the ranch. You were washing at the pump after everyone had gone in, thought no one was watching. There was a moment when you straightened up and the moonlight caught your profile. No boy ever had a neck that graceful." Lillian blushed, grateful for the darkness. "Yet you said nothing." "I figured you had good reason for the disguise. And I wanted to understand why before revealing that I knew." She raised herself on one elbow to look at him, though his features were barely visible in the dim light. "Most men would have exposed me immediately." "I'm not most men," he said simply, drawing her down for a kiss that expressed everything words could not. Spring arrived in a burst of wildflowers across the high country. Lillian's garden flourished under her care, and the small cabin had transformed into a true home with curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on their bed, and shelves Samuel had built to hold their growing collection of books. Mrs. Thornton had been delighted to discover Lillian's skill with horses, and often called upon her to help with the breeding program she was developing. Together, They were selectively breeding stock that combined the stamina of Western Mustangs with the strength of Eastern thoroughbreds. "You have an eye for good bloodlines," Mrs. Thornton remarked one afternoon as they watched a new foal testing its spindly legs. "And a patience few possess when it comes to training." Lillian smiled, recognizing the compliment for the rare gift it was from this formidable woman who had carved her own path in a man's world. "I learned early that patience often succeeds where force fails." The older woman nodded, a lesson too few ever learn. By summer, Lillian's monthly courses had not appeared for long enough to confirm what she had begun to suspect. When she shared the news with Samuel, his joy was boundless. "A child," he whispered, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our child. Are you pleased?" She asked, though his radiant expression answered the question. "Beyond measure," he assured her. "Though I worry for you the birthing, I mean, we're far from doctors here, Mrs. Thornton delivered 4 children of her own and has midwifed for half the women in the territory," Lillian reminded him. "I'll be well looked after." As her body changed with the growing child, Lillian often thought of the binding she had once worn to conceal her femininity. Now, she gloried in the curves that spoke of new life, the visible evidence of love and hope for the future. Their son was born on a clear February morning in 1891, with Mrs. Thornton's capable hands guiding him into the world, and Samuel pacing anxiously outside until the first lusty cry announced the new arrival. William Seth Orton, they named him, honoring both Samuel's father and his brother. As she held her son to her breast, Lillian marveled at how far she had traveled, not just in miles, but in the journey from frightened young woman to confident wife and mother. "He has your eyes," Samuel murmured, perched beside her on the bed, his finger caught in his son's surprisingly strong grip. "And your chin," she countered with a smile. "Poor boy," Samuel laughed. "He's perfect," he declared, "as is his mother." In the years that followed, their family grew. A daughter, Catherine Rose, joined them 2 years after William, and another son, James, 2 years after that. Their small cabin expanded with rooms Samuel added as their needs changed, and the garden Lillian had started became a productive plot that supplied much of their food. Mrs. Thornton eventually sold them a parcel of land and a small herd to start their own operation, recognizing in Samuel the same drive and integrity that had built her own success. They named their modest, spread the Double Heart Ranch, a symbol that represented their journey from 2 solitary souls to a united family. One summer evening in 1898, as they sat on the porch watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Lillian leaned against Samuel's shoulder with a contented sigh. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't seen through my disguise?" she asked. Samuel's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Often," he admitted, "though I like to think fate would have found another way to bring us together." "Fate, or your remarkably perceptive eyes," she teased. "It wasn't just what I saw," he said thoughtfully. "It was what I felt, that connection from the first moment in that saloon. As if my heart recognized yours before my mind understood why." Lillian smiled, watching as William, now 7, helped 3-year-old James capture a glowing insect in cupped hands, while 5-year-old Catherine directed the operation with all the authority her small frame could muster. "I spent so long hiding," she mused. "First behind my father's protection, then behind Lee's disguise. I never imagined freedom would come from being truly seen." Samuel turned to her, his eyes reflecting the same love that had changed her life nearly a decade before. "And I never imagined finding home in another person's eyes," he said softly. "Yet here we are, she agreed, reaching up to touch his weathered cheek. exactly where we belong. As night settled fully over their land, they called the children in for supper, their voices blending in the familiar rhythms of family life. The stars emerged one by one above their home, witnesses to a love that had begun with a disguise but flourished in truth, a love strong enough to bridge worlds, to see beyond appearances, and to build a future neither had dared to dream possible. For Lillian Orton, who had once hidden her very self to survive, there was no greater joy than being completely, authentically known and loved precisely for who she was.